The Road to Emmaus is a story of hope returned. When the scene opens, we have two of Jesus' old followers, Cleopas and someone else, unnamed. Biblical research tells us that the someone else was probably a woman and probably related to Cleopas, most likely his sister or his wife. These two people had just come from Jerusalem, where their leader had been executed by the government for preaching and teaching the very same message that gave them the most hope. But now that was all over. After all, if he had died, perhaps his message hadn't been so true. After all, if he had died, perhaps now wasn't the right time for a change. After all, if he had died, perhaps God had abandoned them. Finally, after all these years of steadfast loving kindness, after all, injustice and inequity were everywhere, and nothing upset the God of Abraham faster than injustice and inequity. So they left Jerusalem quietly and walked along to the town of Emmaus. Perhaps they were angry. Perhaps they were confused. Perhaps they were worried about the future and the implication of the rabbi's crucifixion and what that might have on whatever plans they had constructed for their coming days. We know they were confused because of the sightings of Jesus. And we know that they had, at least in some measure, lost hope. It makes me think of April 4th, 1968, 40 years and 2 days ago. Now, it bears mentioning that I was not alive then and you were, but all the same, I thought I would point out the parallel I see. The two situations are very different, of course. To name just one thing, Jesus was executed by the state, and Martin was assassinated by a guy with a gun aiming out the window. But for all of that, there are parallels. They were both religious leaders in love with the God of Abraham. They both preached in public places, echoing the many prophets' cry for justice, peace, and equity in the land. They, both of them, really loved. And the brutal and tragic death of both men stunned and outraged all who took them seriously, not only for the horrible personal tragedy of the loss of this loving and wise teacher, but of what that intentional killing would mean for the process that that preacher, that rabbi, had been a part of. Neither one was killed randomly. They were both killed because they were seen as a threat. And indeed, both Jesus the Messiah and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and countless others have been brutally and sometimes casually murdered, and others left alive but imprisoned or silenced or vilified because they did pose a threat, and they still do pose a threat. In the words of the Esquivel poem, they threaten us with resurrection, that we may dream awake, that we may watch while we sleep, that we do love and live in the midst of death, and that our deaths serve as resurrection for others. Now let me back up for a moment and have a moment of self-disclosure. I'm 29 years of age. I've never seen war. I've never seen race riots. I've never been in a protest that hasn't been peaceful and reasonably respectful. I've never attacked someone, and I've never been attacked by someone physically. And frankly, I'm grateful for these things. But I like to think that I listen. I've listened to Vietnam veterans pour out their stories like blood on the jungle floor. I've listened to friends and mentors describe the horror of being a sniper, the horror of being the one to drop the napalm, the horror of seeing your friends die right in front of you, the horror of seeing them drink themselves into oblivion afterwards. And I've noticed something in my bystander role. I've noticed, apparently, that the difference between destruction of a nature or of someone else or of yourself and rebuilding, the difference between destruction and healing, the difference between destruction and reconciliation is hope. So far as I can tell, it all boils down to hope. Hope of survival, hope of diplomacy, hope of forgiveness, hope of justice, hope of equity, hope of being able to live a vibrant and flourishing life without fear, any fear. Hope. Hope was what Jesus and Martin also had in common. Hope, an ability to inspire hope, an ability to build hope, grow hope in the most barren of environments, the deep south of these United States, or the edge of a Mediterranean outpost in the Roman Empire. And when they died, they shared in a momentary loss of hope among their followers. That also is a parallel. But of course, that is not the end of the story, or their story, or our story. The course of race relations did not stop in April of 1968. The Jewish Reformation didn't end on Good Friday some 2 millennia ago. The hope lives on. The hope continues to grow. Even when all hope seems to have dissipated, like a fog slowly melting away, you never know when you might have a chance encounter with the living God on the road to your next seemingly hopeless destination. You never know when that encounter might change everything.